Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. On this episode, we will have a conversation with Dr. Bron Taylor. Bron has written a compelling book, Dark Green Religion, Nature, Spirituality, and the Planetary Future. Bron Taylor's scholarly work engages the quest for environmentally sustainable societies, appearing in articles, books, and a multi-volume encyclopedia. He examines a wide range of phenomena, especially grassroots environmental movements and organizations and international institutions, with special attention to their moral and religious dimensions. An academic entrepreneur and program builder, he led the initiative to create an academic major in the environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, later initiated and was elected the first president of the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture, while also founding its affiliated journal. Recruited to fill the Samuel S. Hill Ethics Chair at the University of Florida and appointed in 2002, he played a leading role in constructing the world's first PhD program with an emphasis in religion and nature. Most recently, he has been involved in an international think tank exploring ways to more effectively promote an environmentally sustainable future, and has published articles on surfing as aquatic nature religion, which I'm really interested in talking to you about the surfing aspect of this. And I'm also going to quote briefly from the dust jacket of Bron's book, because I think it really captures what he is interested in and has been working on. And it says he's tracing a wide range of groups, radical environmental activists, lifestyle-focused bioregionalists, surfers, New Agers involved in ecopsychology, and groups that hold scientific narratives as sacred. Taylor addresses a central theoretical question: how can environmentally oriented, spiritually motivated individuals and movements be understood as religious when many of them reject religious and supranational worldviews? So, Bron, welcome to Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. So excited to talk to you today.
Well, it's nice to be with you and your listeners.
Great. So, Bron, this is Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves, and I always start off by asking people what inspired them on their life's journey. Was there a particular event or epiphany that happened to you?
Well, there's probably several moments along this long and strange road. And I think I'll start by mentioning that when I was 13, I was fortunate to move within walking distance to the beach in Ventura, California. And I happened to come at that time into a family that was struggling a great deal. I didn't have much adult supervision. And so in sort of two ways, I drifted. I drifted to the beach, as I mentioned, and I drifted into the Southern California Jesus movement, which was very hot at the time. And so during my teenage years, I was very much involved in both of those kind of subcultures. Fortunately for me, the beach rat thing led to certain kinds of skills in the ocean, which led to a good-paying blue-collar job with California State Parks, which you, as one of my former bosses, actually, in state parks at Asilomar, know about a little bit. And then when I finally was able to get away to a four-year college after a community college in Ventura, because of my interest in religion and psychology, I did a double major. But I had been deeply involved in the evangelical subcultures, and at Chico, I began to learn about a kind of prophetic and social justice-oriented stream of Christianity that the evangelicals I had been hanging with never mentioned to me. And that troubled me no small amount. Why is there this whole branch of Christianity I hadn't heard about? And I got very interested in movements for the so-called liberation theology movements that fused a kind of a left-wing social and economic analysis to the teachings of Jesus as they saw them promoting peace and social justice. And for a time was very much convinced by those who were arguing that if you're going to follow Jesus, you must be a pacifist because that was the path that he chose and advocated. Now, at the same time, I'm starting off as a young ocean lifeguard in Southern California, and I'm dealing with the kind of problems along the beaches of Southern California that you know very well. There's some really mean people that come to our beaches, and if we want to protect them not only from their own misjudgments in the ocean, we also have to protect them from the mean people that sometimes come to our parks. And I was also convinced in reading more of the liberation theologians that to take a completely categorical pacifist view was really a position of privilege that most people didn't have. Mm-hmm. And having that direct experience with people who were going to be unconvinced by expressions of the importance of nonviolence. And at that point, I had started to pursue graduate studies in ethics. I thought, well, most people who do ethics, they're doing them from the ivory tower. They're not really engaged either in concrete social movements, nor in dealing with profound social problems. And of course, in Southern California, all the urban problems that you have in Southern California, they come to the beach, especially when it's hot. Mm-hmm. So I thought that if I'm going to be kind of doing ethics in a realistic way, it certainly would make sense for me to go ahead and move from that frontline ocean lifeguard seasonal job to accepting the peace officer responsibilities that come with that when you promote into a permanent position. So that's where we met, of course, at Sillamar, in the State Park Training Academy. And that experience was invaluable, going to Huntington Beach and working in a very high enforcement area, as well as what is probably the most intense rescue beach in the world.
Yes.
Really helped me to think through how you do that kind of work with integrity and with, in a way that respects all people who come to the park, in a way that decelerates conflict, doesn't exacerbate them, as we've seen far too many examples from among law enforcement people. So, and at the same time, because I was doing the ethics stuff, I don't remember exactly how this happened, but I was asked to join the Equal Employment Opportunity Committee of the department and ended up helping to construct some of the curriculum for our anti-discrimination policies and our affirmative action policies, which, as you know, had been kind of forced on the department by the State Personnel Board because the department for so long had been pretty lily white and not really reflective of the diversity of the Californians whom we serve. So I did that, and that led to a dissertation and a first book writing about anti-discrimination law and affirmative action policies within my own department and making an argument based on my assessment of how that was going.
So, Bron, it sounds like instead of one particular epiphany or thing, this was almost an amalgam. It was a continuation. So some of us are inspired by, one thing. We wake up one day and go, aha. And in your case, it seems like you were having a series of experiences that were building, if not to a crescendo, at least to a particular direction. And it was a series of events that just started you on your journey.
I think there was one thing that kind of qualifies as an epiphany, and that was one night, probably when I was 13 or 14, when there was some violence at home. And I just walked down to the beach in the middle of the night and looked out over the ocean, and there were anchovies jumping in the moonlight that was reflecting on the water, and the stars were out. And I thought of that turmoil back home, and I looked out at the ocean and at the sky there and at the anchovies jumping in the moonlight. And I just had this kind of reassuring feeling that, something's all right with the world, that this human stuff isn't all there is. It isn't all that matters, that there's still something exceptionally beautiful and wondrous about the world and the universe. And that has stuck with me. Indeed, I think it was that experience that when I was studying all this liberation theology and studying ethics and religious and philosophical ethics, I was also troubled by the lack of attention to the natural world in the overwhelming majority of that. And so when I was in graduate school, a few voices began to come out. This was at the time of the emergence of the very discipline of environmental ethics, environmental philosophy. There were a few religious studies scholars who began to talk about the liberation of nature. John Cobb down in Claremont, California, Rosemary Ruther up in the Bay Area wrote a book called New Woman, New Earth. And they were beginning to extend the moral community beyond our own species in a way that I found interesting and compelling. So as I was wrapping up my dissertation and, of course, working for Parks for almost 15 years, to my shock, I got a job offer in Wisconsin. And I decided to give it a try. I didn't resign for a couple of years from Parks because I wasn't sure I was going to like it. I wasn't sure they would like me. And it so happened that a guy named Dave Foreman, who was the most charismatic of the co-founders of the radical environmental group Earth First, showed up.
Yes, I know him well.
I had been following that guy for a few years at this point, reading their journals and everything. And I had discerned that there was something pretty spiritual going on that was animating many of those activists, but it was really out of my frame of reference because I wasn't a hippie, I wasn't a new ager, I wasn't, someone from an eco-anarchist background, as many of those activists were. But I thought, what a great muse it would be after meeting him and the feral ones who came to hear him talk. I thought, what a great muse it would be to do another one of these studies where you immerse yourself in a context and take seriously their claims. Because I've always felt, just as I felt when I was studying Martin King and the civil rights movement, that when people are willing to risk their freedom to convince you of some great moral cause, the least we can do is to listen carefully to them before we lock them up. So I wasn't sure about these people. I wasn't sure about their ecological claims that we were precipitating a massive extinction event, that resource regimes were largely corrupt at the federal level, that there was this revolving door between the logging industry and the regulators and so forth, that the logging companies and the U.S. Forest Service were in cahoots to clear cut to oblivion and destroy the natural variety of North America. And I also wasn't sure about the kind of nature spirituality that was animating some of those folks, but some of that kind of rang a bell to me, I guess in part because of my own experience down at the ocean and on occasion in the mountains. So I spent much of the 90s studying that movement and became much more of a lay ecologist as a result, and began writing widely about grassroots environmental movements around the world and trying to wrestle with their strengths and weaknesses. And of course, a lot of that drew me into these efforts to figure out what's the proper human place in the biosphere and the universe, and what if anything does spirituality or religion have to do with it? So that's kind of been what I've been wrestling with now for decades.
Well, let's get into that a little bit, because I'm really interested in hearing your take on religion, spirituality, and I hopefully have some challenging questions for you. You being an academic, I'm sure you won't mind, having gone through a dissertation and having to defend a thesis. So I'll try not to make it that painful.
But, bring it on. It's always fun.
But why dark green religion? Where does that concept come from? Let's just get right into that.
Well, I like double meanings and the mystery of them, so I thought it was a good title to kind of, draw in curiosity, just like your question. But the dark, I mean in two senses. One, dark as in deep ecological, a depth valuing of nature, valuing nature intrinsically for its own sake, not only because it's useful to us in some ways. So this has various ways of people talking about that aspect. Deep ecology is one, biocentrism or life-centered ethics is another, ecosystem-centered ethics or ecocentrism is another way of capturing that idea that values are not just about us, but that all life has value. Dark in another sense, that as a person who's a significant part of my background is studying religion in general, as you well know, religions are a two-edged sword. Sometimes they're exceptionally beautiful and they promote great art, pro-social behavior, sometimes even pro-environmental behavior, but sometimes they are dark in the sense of deadly. They can, often religions divide various groups of people into some kind of superhuman or holy category, regular people, and then subhuman people, and then figure out ways to justify suppressing those who they consider beneath them. So by the dual meaning there, I also signal that if we're going to look at such phenomena that I'm calling dark green religion, we should both be alert to the environmental values that it has, but also the possible dangers of it. And where do those come from? Well, in ethics, we always have this kind of conflict between what we could call holism, or that is ethics that look at the good of a whole of some sort, a commonweal, and the rights of individual organisms. And usually these ethics are anthropocentric, so it's usually about the commonweal, the human commonweal, and the rights of individual humans. But the same sorts of tensions in here to when we're talking about environmental values. So if you have an ecocentric value system where what is good and right is that which promotes the flourishing of the ecosystems and all that dwell within, there's always the possibility that some of the organisms or even species within them in somebody's mind would need to be suppressed or culled in the interest of the well-being of the whole. So there's always this kind of this is where ethics leads to difficult decisions also. I mean, how do you balance those things? And are there certain kinds of individual rights that trump the well-being of the whole? And this is what ethicists have been arguing about for millennia, really.
No, I understand. Well, someday I'm going to share with you an essay I wrote for Duke University and their environmental program on bioevolutionary ethics, which tries to get at some of that and talk about how ethics develop. But today this is about you. And
we could have a whole seminar on that, because I'm also interested in how ethics evolve over time and so forth. So this whole idea of evolutionary ethics, I think, is very interesting. We maybe should talk about that another time.
Yeah, maybe we'll have you back and we'll just talk about that. I know the people at Duke University were very interested in that. I was surprised that they accepted that essay, but people in the ethics area, like you say, are very interested in the evolution of ethics and how ethics actually come back. I attach it very much to biological evolution as well. Yeah. But so I was interested also. I mean, the book is so expansive and there's so many things to talk about. Yeah. So to some degree, this is going to be, my take on those things that interested me, that I pulled out, that I thought were fascinating. But one of them had to do with, I note in the first part of your book, you seem to identify Christianity as, quote, Western religion. And I want to kind of try to understand that from someone who studies religion like you do, because from my point of view, I mean, isn't Christianity, based on the teaching of Jesus, who's from the Middle East, whose identity now is being debated as to whether or not he was dark-skinned, light-skinned, Jewish, Black,
Right.
African, or whatever. And of course, there are Orthodox Christians who are clearly not from the West. So why do you focus in on Christianity as a Western religion?
Well, I think all these categories can be problematized and nuanced, as you suggest. But in general, the Occidental tradition or the Western tradition, scholars tend to use those terms as shorthand for religions and philosophy that emerged from the Near East, including the biblical lands, and then spread most decisively west. And so that would be in Northwest, really, into Europe, and then through the colonial period into all over the Americas and to a great extent throughout Africa. So it's kind of a shorthand thing, and today, of course, Christianity, also like the religions that originated on the Indian subcontinent, that we, as shorthand, we often call the Asian religions. They're global religions. I mean, you have Christians in every region of the world, same as you have devotees of the various religions that evolved on the Indian subcontinent everywhere. So it's really just a kind of a shorthand way to talk about that general millennia-long spread of Western philosophies and religions.
So how did you come in your mind to marry this idea of religiosity, if you will, with nature? I mean, you say in your book that most people who think of spirituality as opposed to religion think of spirituality in terms of its connection with nature. And I want to explore a little bit, because I think it goes to the heart of your thesis about how you marry this notion of spirituality and religion with nature.
So again, falling back on this shorthand notion of in the Western world, the template for understanding religion is based on the so-called Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, those religions that trace their lineage to the prophet Abraham. That's another shorthand term, Abrahamic religion. Just refer to the three of those that are sometimes called the monotheistic traditions or the Western religious traditions. And so with that template of religion, and the tendency of Western people to define or to sort of recognize religion is when it has certain types of characteristics, such as there's some kind of invisible, immaterial, divine being. There's some kind of organizational structure, usually a built environment, where people go to perform rituals, which are repeated in regular ways to reinforce the doctrines of the tradition and to evoke or awaken an experience of the divine in some way. And in kind of the common consciousness, that's what most typically comes to mind in people who have a Western background, and increasingly around the world because of the spread of the academic study of religion and how that's been appropriated elsewhere. We tend to think of religion as that which is organized, that is social, is about immaterial divine beings or forces in some ways. Whereas in common language, common parlance, increasingly people have come to use the word spirituality to refer to something that's a more personal quest meaning, spiritual or physical, involving spiritual or physical or spiritual well-being, and maybe healing, more individualistic, and part of that is more individualistic in that you can go directly to nature itself, is a common kind of perception within what people increasingly call spirituality. Now, I think that binary between religion and spirituality, at least for a religion scholar, is kind of a false binary. Because if you look at what goes on with those who would say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, they may not have built structures that are identified as mosques or synagogues or churches or cathedrals, but they may not have people that they call priests or rabbis, but they have spiritual leaders. They have ritual experts. They have institutional purveyors, So they have, if you look at the traits and characteristics most commonly associated with the R word, with religion, you find that also, but in fresh ways when you're looking at stuff that a lot of people think is spiritual. And also you find that when you look at a lot of stuff that a lot of people consider to be secular. And so these kinds of scientific worldviews that you are so interested in that lead people to have a meaningful worldview and a purpose and a sense of an understanding of their place in the biosphere and the cosmos.
Sure.
We can analyze those with the same sorts of tools that we use to analyze religion, and that can be quite illuminating, even if in the final analysis we decide, well, the way I'm going to define religion doesn't include that. So it's a little weird because in the Dark Green Religion book, I say, in the final analysis, I don't care whether anybody wants to call anything I'm talking about in this book religion. I'm completely indifferent to that. But if you use the tools that social scientists and humanities scholars use to analyze religion, there's a lot of phenomena out there that has at least a quasi-religious dimension that we can illuminate by using those tools. And that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book.
So almost in a general sense, and I certainly don't want to put words in your mouth, but I came away with the feeling, especially in your last statement about, being kind of indifferent as to whether you call it religion or not. It's like anything that seeks spirit, purpose, and meaning, no matter in what genre or under what rubric, could be called religious or spiritual, because clearly within the very well-defined notions of religion, whether it be Abrahamic or whether it be Eastern or whatever, there's a strong spiritual component. Almost every word out of Jesus's mouth was about the Spirit and about the Holy Spirit and the connection of God through Spirit, and an extreme emphasis on spirituality. And on the other hand, those, as you were saying, who say, well, I'm not, religious, I'm, spiritual, are really seeking the same thing to some extent. Wouldn't you say that's true?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's, human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We're trying to figure out, what the hell, what's going on here, right?
Right.
And we have existential angst because we live. We have both, hopefully, more experiences that are ecstatic, but we also suffer in various ways, and eventually, of course, as mortal beings, we die, and we lose those we love. So it's exceptionally human to wonder what, if any, meaning there is to this. And humans have been very creative, I think it's fair to say, in coming up with meaning systems.
Right.
And some of those, going back briefly to the evolutionary thing, we have very interesting scholarly theorizing about why it is that religious worldviews evolve. In what ways, and part of this goes to how are the ways in which religions promote pro-social behavior, which helps us to survive and to pass down our genes. Some societies, there have been very good studies that show, have managed to co-evolve with nature, ecologically adaptive lifeways, which include religious rituals that help to regulate ecosystems.
Mhm.
And oftentimes there are religious leaders that are kind of the de facto environmental managers in these societies, right?
Right.
And so it's very interesting to look at the ways in which both adaptive ecological and social systems evolve and maladaptive ones evolve. And we've got examples of both. And I think that these systems, certainly it's certainly reasonable to have a definition of religion where all of these attempts would be included. The trick is that in the West, the template was that you don't have religion unless there's invisible divine beings, right?
Mhm.
Now that template can work well with a lot of the inspirited religions, indigenous, and those also originating in Asia. But that kind of essentialist definition of religion would exclude an awful lot of the kind of meaning and purpose seeking that you're talking about.
Mhm.
So some people want to restrict the word religion only for people and groups that perceive something immaterial or invisible as a force or a being. If people want to, it's kind of like the devil's in the definitions. If people want to have an essentialist definition like that and operationalize their definitions and be clear about it, that's fine with me.
Mhm.
But I think it's helpful to just have a broader kind of what we call in the book, what I and others call the family resemblance approach. Let's not get too hung up on exactly where the boundaries of, where does religion end and that which is not religion begin. I don't know, and I don't care.
Mhm. Mhm.
I just want to try to understand our species better and our relations with each other and our relations with all the other beings and systems that we are a part of.
Understand. Well, that leads me to, you're talking about this family, and in this family, I mean, you have a little chart in the book about animism and Gaian Earth religion, and I was fascinated when the concept of Gaia first came out, but I was
Right.
equally fascinated for two reasons, because it talked about, or at least one aspect of it talked about the Earth, Mother Earth, this idea that the Earth was alive. And on the other hand, it grew out of the scientific concept of, the biosphere being interconnected and interwoven. And its proponent cautioned people against making too much out of this and making it into a, quote, religion in a general sense. And so I find that kind of fascinating. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, Gaia, how that developed, and the notion of animism, and how you divide the two, or put the two together in a family, but they're slightly different.
Sure. Well, let's start with the notion of the Earth as Gaia. It's really not a new idea. It's just a trope that's been applied in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
Organicism, the idea that is an ancient philosophy in the West, in the Western world, the idea that the world is deeply interconnected, that the world functions as kind of an organ. And there's cognates in that in some of the Asian religious traditions that talk about the interpenetration of all the mutual forthcoming of the world in its interconnections. So the perception of the world as a kind of a self-regulating organism didn't originate with James Lovelock, who wrote the Gaia hypothesis and eventually collaborated with Lynn Margulis on that. Indeed, he recognized also that that before him, he didn't even know James Hutton had basically been making the same argument. And you could say the same thing for Van Humboldt and who wrote Cosmos and others.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a human perception that's been around for a while. What James Lovelock did, borrowing from a friend of his, he took the name for the ancient Greek goddess of the earth, Gaia, And he gave it a new name, and he argued that the biosphere functions as a self-regulating organism in which the organisms within the biosphere create the conditions under which life can flourish.
Mhm.
The term was sticky in the mind, and we have some interesting theories about why certain ideas go viral, right? And first, they have to be good tropes. They have to be sticky in the mind. They have to be easy to explain. So Gaia is an evocative term that's pretty easy to explain. And so a whole lot of this kind of organicist philosophy and often spirituality has adopted this as a kind of shorthand way to talk about that aspect. And by the way, James Lovelock himself, I was happy to that he agreed to write an essay in my Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature. I'll send it to you. It's called Gaian Pilgrimage.
Mhm.
And he talks about how he was bemused by the spiritual reception of his hypothesis and the enthusiasm of overtly religious people for it, for some of them. And he muses how he came to appreciate that, even while he's still really just a scientist about this. But he saw in it certain kinds of attitudes that he found in his father, who was very connected to nature. So anyway, that's the Gaia stuff. Do you want me to talk a little about the animism stuff?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So there has been a wellspring of interest around the world in animism, especially in the last few decades. Now, the term was invented by the anthropologist E.B. Tyler, who was studying peoples of South Africa. And he was trying to understand the difference between people he saw, quite frankly, as superior Europeans to what he saw as more primitive South Africans. But there was also this, there was never a denigration of the South Africans as like not intelligent or not rational. He was saying that what their understanding is completely rational. They see the difference between living bodies and dead bodies, and they wonder what's the difference. And so there must be some spirit animating them. And then he also had some theories about dreams and so forth that I won't go into. But this term animism for the idea that the natural world is inspirited, that maybe it's inspirited in part by the ancestors who have gone away. This is quite a global phenomenon. And the term animism for a while was kind of fell out of disfavor because of what people thought were its kind of racist implications. But in recent decades, increasing numbers of people have said, well, gee, if I'm anything, I'm an animist. I believe that the world is inspirited by, and that it's full of spiritual intelligences, as I put it in the book. Or people can arrive at a kind of animistic perception that the world is full of persons with whom we can be in relationship and to whom we owe ethical obligations without any kind of non-material spiritual dimensions to it. So what I wrestle with in the book is these new forms of animism where you have indigenous people around the world, you have people revitalizing paganism in the Scandinavian North or the Baltic states of Estonia, and they're calling themselves animists, and you have indigenous people owning the term. So the term has gone native. It's widely accepted by people who want to stress the personhood, agency, and value of non-human organisms. And sometimes that also has a kind of spiritual dimension where there's definitely this kind of numinous or divine presence in the world in some way. Mm-hmm. So these can be, these Gaian perceptions and these animistic perceptions, they can resemble longstanding religious traditions that have immaterial divine beings or forces involved, or they can be entirely naturalistic and be based on the sciences or our personal relationships with companion animals or farm animals, domestic animals that we are literally in relationship with. And I think for modern people, many of whom are dubious about the world's predominant religions and their metaphysical claims, in their quests for meaning, many of these folks are gravitating toward these kinds of spiritualities, which is to kind of create a trope to think about these things I've called dark green religion.
Well, interestingly enough, and this only comes from perhaps people like you and I who have studied religion of course, my family, just about every ancestor of mine was a minister or missionary of some sort. And in reading, scripture very closely, if you listen to the words of Jesus, there's one particular passage, and I'm heavily paraphrasing here because I'm old and don't remember everything anymore. So I'm heavily paraphrasing, but where he mentioned that if, people don't praise him and recognize him for the divine messenger that he is, that God would raise up the rocks and trees to praise him. And it very much captures this notion of animism, that there's a spirit, within all of nature, and even within the teachings of Jesus. And I'm sure a lot of the evangelicals that you were involved in, if you told them that or say, now read this carefully, there's animism here, they would be shocked, or they would go, oh, no, that's not the right interpretation.
There's some pretty interesting Gnostic gospels too that talk about, if you turn over a rock, you turn over a tree, there is God,
Right, exactly. Well, speaking of those kinds of things, so in the science seminars that I teach, I did a whole seminar, a series on quantum mechanics, and I invited kind of because I wanted a lot of different perspectives, I invited this New Age fellow who taught meditation and that sort of thing, who had imbued his New Age beliefs with quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm. And there's this whole group, I don't know if you've studied it or are familiar with it, but there's this whole movement that is now latched on to quantum mechanics as a scientific vehicle for communicating kind of this universal notion of spirituality, and that if you drill down into quantum mechanics, it supports the notion that there's this oneness and spirituality to the universe. So I call it quantum mechanical universe religion. But I don't know. Do you have any comments on that? Have you seen that? You don't mention it in your book specifically, but
there's one thing that I said in the book. I think I said something to the effect of, if I'm not crazy, my readers are going to be thinking of phenomena that fits what I'm talking about, that I either know about but didn't have the time to talk about because the publisher was already squawking at 120,000 words, or something I don't know about but that is another example of this kind of emerging nature-related spirituality. So there definitely could have been a chapter of what you're talking about. I mean, we can go back into the Whiteheadian metaphysics. We can go look at the way the quantum theorists have been appropriated by philosophers and some religious studies scholars as a meaning system. We could look at process philosophy and process theology. The guy who was really first writing about the liberation of life was John Cobb in Claremont, who was a process theologian and very much drawing on the kinds of sciences that you're talking about. Even Tom Blake, who was going back to surfing, who was the chief missionary, really, of surfing after Duke Kahanamoku from Hawaii. He became a disciple, basically, of the Duke. And he studied these emerging sciences, and he even wrote a book. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but something about, the atom and the wave or something like this. And he once scrawled on the bluffs of Santa Monica Beach, nature equals God, as a kind of reflection of the sense of what some of the quantum theorists are saying. Everything is so deeply interpenetrated and deeply related that we can be inspired by that kind of profound interconnection. And that, again, that's another form of organicism. It's a kind of cosmic organicism. And it's quite powerful because of the very sophisticated sciences that back it up.
Right.
Indeed, so much of the naturalistic poles of what I'm calling dark green religion has cultural traction and power because it doesn't depend on an individual guru or a mystical seer or an experience that somebody else has had somewhere else in some other place and time. It's something that's accessible to everyone who is reasonably literate and has the privilege of studying science. And this is why one of the things I ask my readers to think about is, okay, so we've had the world's predominant religions, the axial age religions, percolating and representing a very large proportion of the human community for millennia now.
Mm-hmm.
But what about 500 years from now? What about 1,000 years from now? What about 2,000 years from now? What are the understandings of the human place in the biosphere and cosmos that are going to be on the up, an increasing proportion of the human community? And which ones will become more part of our mythic legacy, like, the Roman pantheon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my hunch is, based on current and recent trends, and the Darwinian revolution is only 160 years plus a couple old,
Mm-hmm.
that these sorts of dark green spiritualities will assume, including what you're talking about, will assume an increasingly important part of the meaning systems for our species.
Without a doubt. So I wanted to. There's so much I want to talk to you about, but I do want to mention, in the context of what we're discussing right now, 2 or 3 episodes back, I had Dr. Pace from Germany on. He wrote a wonderful book called The One. And he, instead of organicism, he talks about monism, which has been,
Sure,
historically embedded in humanity going back thousands of years. And
yep.
He's a theoretical physicist, and he believes that ultimately some of the crises in physics, that is, trying to unify, gravity and quantum mechanics and a few other areas that have been problematic with physicists, will grow out of the understanding of from one comes everything and everything is one. And it's a concept that, of course, has been around for millennia. And he's saying that, we really need to get back to this. I bring it up in the context of religion because he takes great pains to say, but wait a minute, reader, don't turn this into a religion. Don't go off on a tangent and take what I'm saying, and create something, he almost says, something crazy. And so which leads me to ask you really about, surfing as a religion. I mean, I know you're deeply, steeped in the culture of surfing, as am I from another perspective. I hung out with so many surfers in my life, and some of my best friends, and one of my closest friends now that I just met in Ecuador is not only a surfer, but he shaped boards, and he made some of the most classic surfboards you'd ever want to
Nice.
see. He's just and he's heavily tattooed and deeply, spiritual. So I really understand what you're talking about because I've been so much a part of that culture for so long. But I've really never thought of it in terms of a religion. And you take a lot of ink to talk about surfing as having a religious component. Why is that? I mean, is that simply because you have such a personal connection, or is there something real there?
Well, I think certainly my own experience shapes the kind of analysis. But if we take this kind of family resemblances approach to religion and look at surfing as a practice, what do surfers tend to do? They tend to get up early and go out into the ocean. A lot of what they do is sit out there while the waves roll in. Where do those waves come from? They come from the Big Bang, ultimately. So there's this kind of meditative dimension to just sitting out there. It's an opportunity when you're between sets or on a slow day where you're just there with your thoughts. But you're not just there with your thoughts, you're or with the waves. There's also the marine creatures out there. Mm-hmm. And if one does that practice for a long time, maybe it's just a leap of moral imagination, but you start to feel yourself in relationship with the other organisms out there. You feel like you get to know them a little bit, maybe a little of their types of personalities. You know, the seagulls who are playful like we are. The way, I mean, not the pelicans. I mean, the way they surf the waves, and the cetaceans and so forth. So there's a kind of it's possible to have a kind of an animistic perception that emerges from the practice over a long period of time. It was interesting when I did this scholarly article about surfing as a form of aquatic nature religion, and honestly, the surfing community blew up. It was my 15 minutes of global fame. You know, the biggest surfing magazines published excerpts or analyses of my thing, and every time that an editor orchestrated something about this, they did their own kind of testimony. And you remember from church, right? People would give their testimonies, right? And the testimonies of the editors were, yeah, surfing's kind of my religion too. And they didn't really know, they were a little bit embarrassed to say something about it, but now it was a little easier to say something about it because you got this scholar who's kind of vindicating what they're saying. It's not crazy. So again, is it religion or is it, a meaningful worldview? But there's also some weird experiences that happen with that relativize things, like the experience where time slows down in a tube, as they say. And for those of us who have had that experience that relativizes time and space in a certain way, it makes you, it kind of deepens your thinking about where the human is and how relative certain things are that we take for granted. So for some people who maybe those who are more philosophically or spiritually inclined, it develops into a kind of a part of a kind of spiritual worldview.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what do you think that's important for humanity as a whole? I mean, surfing as a religious experience. Well, we know there are, so many levels, and you mentioned it in your book of surfers and subcultures of surfers, and sometimes the culture is violent, sometimes it's exclusionary. Right. It has different aspects to it, and sometimes it's hard to reconcile. Of course, in established religion, it's worse because we've had 100-year wars and other wars between Catholics and Protestants. So it's not unusual to have these kind of violent, tensions under the auspices of religion. But how do surfers see that? I mean, some of the quotes you have in the book are kind of deep with respect to what surfers feel in a visceral sense about religion and what their feelings can mean for humanity as a whole. I'm just interested in your view on can that notion spread, and does it really contribute to peace and a better understanding between human beings if practiced in the most positive form?
I sometimes think that the most important experience that we might call mystical is that which helps us to transcend our perception of individual ego. And surfing has an uncanny ability to humble a person. These are tremendous forces, and again, they are universal forces, and it can both kind of get you off your high horse and thinking that you're all that as an individual or even as a species. And it can make you feel like also that you belong to all of it, that you're a part of it. And that goes to what you were talking about a few minutes ago when you talked about the monist experience, the experience of oneness with everything. And that in some ways is that experience of oneness with everything, the transcendence of ego. That's the kind of archetypal mystical experiences that that transcends time, place, ethnicity, region. And it could be what, Leibniz and Aldous Huxley later called the perennial philosophy that emerges and people arrive at in all sorts of ways.
Right.
So some people arrive at it through surfing. Some people arrive at it by walking in a deep forest. There's all sorts of, I think of that old cheesy movie with David Carradine. You remember what the name of that film was when we were both young? I'm not remembering, but it was about this guru who goes around the West, and one of the aphorisms that he would say, well, there are many paths, grasshopper, to his accolades. I think it was called Kung Fu, actually.
Yeah, it was Kung Fu, right.
It was Kung Fu. And so when we talk about these kinds of perceptions that, look, get over yourself. You're just a speck in the universe. And as Robinson Jeffers, the California poet, put it, to paraphrase, just fall in love outward. And I think that allowing yourself to be just a speck in the universe, to just sort of fall in love outward with all of it, to develop a sense of belonging to it, that redounds in my judgment and experience, and I think the research bears this out, it redounds in pro-social and pro-environmental values. And that includes for a segment of the surfing community arriving at that. So Surfrider, as an organization, is doing all kinds of great environmental work. And interestingly, today, it's not just environmental. It's also social justice oriented. It's also integrating indigenous people into its mission and other, social sectors. So I think in general, and part of what I wrestle with is in the Dark Green Religion book, of course, there are perils here, but how likely are they? And I wrestle with these things. But to the extent that people develop this kind of post-ego sensibility and this falling in love with the world outward, it's very difficult to tilt such spiritualities in a pernicious direction, I argue.
Well, when you were talking about surfing and how kind of a spiritual, religious idea or concept or feeling emerged from that, it made me think of the Masons. And the reason it made me think of the Masons is because, at least one of the historical stories of how they formed was that they were Masons. And they were bricklayers. They were people who built things. And but because of their work, they felt there was a spiritual component to what they were doing, and they formed, these organizations and these societies that, excuse me, clearly today have become spiritual, quote, religious in some ways, and they've built these huge temples and monuments to Masonry, and they have their secret societies. And I was thinking, maybe one day surfers will emerge and have a temple, because you talked about, some of the religious symbols, if you will, like the surfboard and the sacrifices that were made around surfing that took on very much ritualistic forms that you find in Masons. And many of my family members were Masons. They couldn't convince me to ever join. I'm not a joiner, but I know a lot about the culture, and the surfing reminded me of the same thing. So I'm wondering, one day, do you think there's going to be a temple built to surfing? And that's kind of a rhetorical question, but
we could almost argue that those places exist right now if we have the eyes to see them. If we go to Santa Cruz, I don't know when the last time you were in Santa Cruz, but there's a statue of the greatest saint of the surfing cultists, Duke Kahanamoku, out on the bluff there. And then there's a small surfing museum. So one of the things, I'm actually working on a book on dark green religion in museums, art and science museums, but also these kinds of enclaves. One can also talk about surfing museums and what kinds of things are expressed there. Well, you get a sense of who are the saints of the tradition, the people that most move the thing forward. And in some of them, they can be quite evocative, talking about the kinds of spiritual experiences that can go with the practice. So there's so part of what I'm looking at with the dark green religion argument is if people tend to think that to have religion, you have to have organization and you have to have institutions and you have to have buildings, it's really interesting to look at the buildings where dark green spiritualities are being expressed and promoted. So, here's an example. In Ventura, California, there was, I think it was the Elks Club. And before streaming and all this stuff, they would show surfing movies there. And this is where surfers would, when they're not out in the water, they would all come together as a congregation to watch surf movies. And those movies themselves and the kind of music that was orchestrated for them, in my judgment, were clearly designed to evoke, awaken, or reinforce the kinds of ecstatic experiences that can come through surfing. And also sometimes the sublime experiences that can come from surfing. So I think of the famous surf movie, 5 Summer Stories. And when I do a lecture, I have a long lecture on surfing spirituality that I do, and I show excerpts from this film. And a part of it, I show excerpts from 5 Summer Stories where they talk about the big waves in Hawaii. And then it says something like, on smaller days, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something close to, on smaller days, the surfer experiences intimate relations with Mother Ocean. So that sense of belonging is expressed through the arts of the film. And the same thing can be said for so many museums and so forth that I'm going to be doing two talks here in Europe on dark green religion at museums. And just this last year, I went to a museum in Berlin that was doing a thing on theophany, which was listening to the sounds of the ocean from a recording artist who went from one pole to the other. And that was a way he was quite clear about this. I want you to listen to the agency and voices of the ocean. So it was kind of this animistic dimension to it. And then I went to the Pompidou Center in Paris, where there was a World of Networks exhibition. So on the one hand, they talked about all these technological networks and the new sciences. But then toward the end, they started to talk about biological networks. And Suzanne Similard's work on mycorrhizal fungi, helping trees and plants to communicate and flourish and so forth. And at the very end of that, there was a video that was called Quercus, where the species of deciduous trees talked to the humans. So through an act of moral imagination and amazing cinematography, this tree species speaks to us and is in some ways saying, hey, you're not all that. You need us more than we need you. Right. In fact, we don't need you, but our bodies are recording what you're doing, including about the climate. And it concludes with, you need to listen to us. So we're kind of getting schooled by this tree in a script written by an Italian philosopher. So
that's great.
There's all sorts of ways in which these intuitions that many of us have about the value of and the preciousness of this biosphere are being communicated and spreading around the world. And there's just a few examples from surfing to Berlin and Paris.
Well, and you have a whole section in the book where you talk about movies and art as it relates to dark green religion. And I was fascinated by that section where you had the conversation between, what's the Lion King's name, Mufasa, and
Simba.
his son Simba. And I mention it because what comes out of that conversation is the concept of the circle of life.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how much that permeated or has permeated, and of course you know this because of your work, how much that has permeated society worldwide. I mean, that movie in some ways was a religious nature movie that inspired people to understand these connections, and that was the major message people took away, was this concept of the circle of life, and it was a very deep meaning. So it just shows how film, as well, can be such a religious vehicle as well, and the arts in general.
There may be no more powerful film or segment of a film than that one for promoting a kind of dark greens perspective. And one of the traits I identify as emerging with great force, I mean, the world religions emerged to try to help, in part, to try to help people cope with death. Mm-hmm. And what we find among people who have really taken this dark green turn is that while we may feel grief at the loss of loved ones and be sad about our own eventual departure from this earth as we understand it, there's a recognition that death is also the wellspring of new life, and it is the circle of life, and it can be celebrated even in the midst of sadness about, that part of the process where loved ones leave us and we leave loved ones. That's a pretty profound metaphysic, I think, that's being expressed there. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we need to wrap this up, and I need to ask you my other question that's really important, and that is what's in the future of Bron Taylor? Has there been something that has been so influential in your life that it was transcendent, that it changed you forever and has set you on a either futuristic path or is leading to, maybe it's leading to the great unknown? I don't know, but I'm really interested in hearing what's next for you and what maybe happened to you that was transcendent in your life.
Well, certain things stick with you. And I think some of those early experiences that I mentioned have just been reinforced by my returning whenever I get a chance to relatively intact biological systems and can reconnect with that perception and those feelings. I was just back recently. I was invited to do some talks in the Lofoten Islands in the Arctic of Norway and spent a couple weeks up there and experienced the Northern Lights for the first time. And just to deepen the recognition of the absolute, and I'm not afraid to use this kind of terminology, even though I'm in many ways a secular analyst, the miracle of life and the miracle of life in the biosphere, the exceptional privilege to be here. So in one sense, I want to make sure I stay in touch with that kind of experience by not being such a workaholic, on a kind of personal level. But I'd also like to think that, and I've always kind of hoped that this was the case when I write about grassroots environmental movements, which can be very beautiful and can also be very stupid. I hope, and I have some reason to think that by holding a mirror up to our species and looking at what's unfolding and at the positives of it and the dangers, the perils of it, that maybe I can nudge that along, the good parts of that along a little bit. And the reception of this book, the interest in it, which is really what it really is doing, Don, is it is channeling what I think is the best of what's emerging from us. It's not novel what I'm talking about there, but what I think I've been pretty good at doing by traveling around the world in what I call the global environmental milieu. I've just noticed these same patterns emerging all around the world among people of goodwill, from the UN to Earth First and to surfing subcultures. We're a very problematic species. We make all sorts of mistakes. We have all sorts of misperceptions, but there's still a convergence around some things that are really salutary, and that if they could spread with alacrity, I think would lead to the kinds of social transformations that might ameliorate the very severe and accelerating environmental problems that we're increasingly aware of and experiencing. So I guess, I don't know what else to do other than try to keep in touch with that which has animated me by spending more time in relatively wild places, getting out surfing a little bit more. But I'm a writer and a thinker, and so I can't imagine, apart from that, not just doing what I'm doing as long as I have the health to do it. So that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Interesting. Well, if I can kind of summarize, it's the sense of wonder married with a sense of gratefulness and being here, and a sense of how can this all be. Rilke, the poet, wrote a poem that had a lot to do about understanding things, not in nature, interestingly enough, but out of darkness. And a lot of people didn't understand the poem, and I certainly didn't, until I woke up one night, and this has happened on a couple of occasions. I just woke up, got up, and I was in the darkness of my room, and I was just overwhelmed with this feeling of, how can this all be? And that's the only way I can articulate it.
Right.
And I think that's what you're talking about. And if we can get people to understand that in the context of a sense of wonder, gratefulness that's so embedded in nature and the world around us, maybe we would celebrate our common humanity a lot more than we do, rather than our differences. Thank you, Bron, Dr. Taylor.
It's my pleasure, Don. I just remember all the way back to Asilomar and what a class act you were and still are. And I feel very, very privileged to hang out with you here in Zoom land and with your listeners.
Thank you, Bron, for joining us, and we'll have you back again.
All right. I'll look forward to it.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. We've been speaking with Dr. Bron Taylor on his book, Dark Green Religion, Nature, Spirituality, and the Planetary Future. It's available on Amazon. You should really check it out. In the meantime, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.